Hi everyone. Today we have Dr. Talia Marcajani, ND, with us. She is a naturopathic doctor, Great Lakes surfer, and founder of the Good Mood Project. Her area of focus and practice is mental health. And today she's here to share with us about balancing mood during crisis. Welcome, Talia, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Tara, for having me. This is exciting.
Yes, I'm really excited to hear from you too. So tell us about yourself and how you became interested in this particular area of focus.
So I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I think what I was discovering as I was working with patients during my training as an intern when I was still a student was that it didn't matter how successful I was at figuring out a treatment plan for somebody with digestive issues or fatigue. If we weren't addressing the mental health piece, we didn't get very far. And I've always been interested in psychology, psychotherapy, and how the mind works and how our mental and emotional experiences are the filter through which we interact with the world. So it just made sense to me to do deep healing work with people that we should start or at least acknowledge the mental health piece. And I also feel like as naturopaths, we have a lot to offer in the field of mental health because the solutions we know in the conventional system are, well, first of all, we don't really understand where a mental health condition might come from. So it's usually pointed to as a brain imbalance, which is only like a tiny, tiny fraction of what could actually be causing a mental health condition, or even those subclinical conditions of feeling fatigued, just unfulfilled. You know, you don't necessarily have to have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety to feel like you're not in optimal mental health and wellness. And so I feel like there's a lot we can offer as naturopaths, looking at the whole body, looking at somebody's context from which they were raised, their life experiences, the context in which they find themselves in terms of their social support, their nutrition, their sense of purpose, the whole thing. So there's so much to work with, and I feel like we can do so much. So mental health has been an unending journey full of richness and goodness where you can apply so many concepts to help people.
Absolutely. I do think that naturopathic doctors have so much to offer to the field of mental health. And as you pointed out, there doesn't always have to be a diagnosis. It might just be a particular state of being that we find ourselves in that maybe we prefer to not be in, and maybe contributing to some of our symptom picture that we're experiencing. So I think it's really incredible that you put a lot of focus there, and I totally resonate with the idea. Psychology is definitely something that I've been very interested in for a long time, and I can absolutely see how it relates to our physical health as well. So it's really, really important. I love that you're doing this work.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the work you're doing too with resilience, and yes, huge part of mental health, if not one of the major foundations.
True, there's a lot of synergy there. So can you define for us what good mental health really looks like?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a difficult thing to define because, you know, it's not just the absence of symptoms, which is typically how you might define it in the conventional system, right? You feel depressed, and so healing or cure is to remove the depression, whether that just leaves you in a neutral place or not. But I actually asked my community this question because I was curious what people define their own mental health as. And there was a lot of overlap in responses and also some interesting responses as well. So one of the main themes that came up was feeling abundant energy. And I think that, yeah, it's hard to sort of differentiate and separate depression and lack of energy because it's one of the major symptoms of low mood is feeling exhausted and like it's difficult to cope and interact and really participate in your life. So they also responded saying feeling calm and happy. So it's this sense of like low tension and good energy, as opposed to like in an anxiety state, you might have high energy, but high tension. And in a depressed state, you might have low tension, but also low energy. So this sort of like low tension, high energy state where you feel calm and connected, but also happy and energized. They mentioned like mental clarity. One person said pooping regularly. When I'm pooping regularly, my mental health is on point, which speaks to how our brain and body are connected and how there are these signals that your body will send you to tell you that you're slightly off balance, right? Or that your mental health or physical wellness is not optimal. Somebody said, I don't know if it was a joke, but she said avoiding stupid people. So like when I'm avoiding stupid people, I am in my mental optimum, which I would further that and say, like, at least for me, I feel like when I don't see people as stupid. So when you feel patient with the world, right? You're not sort of impatient with things being slow, when I'm waiting in line and I'm not frustrated by, you know, what's happening, when I can be in traffic and be okay with myself. And, you know, not feel frustrated or irritable or like I have a short fuse, like I can sort of be with these imperfections in life. And sleeping well was a big one too. And I think these all tie in, right? It's like sleeping well lends to mental health, and optimal mental health lends to us sleeping well. So there are just these various symptoms that we'll notice. But I think, you know, what we can think of optimal mental health as being is when you feel present and functional and competent in your life. And there's a woman, actually, we'll talk more about her, but her name is Linda Graham, and she wrote a book called Bouncing Back. And she actually talks about the 5 C's of coping, which I think, you know, if those 5 C's are in balance, and actually it's 6 because she added a 6th one. If those 6 C's are in balance, then I feel like we're able to navigate, you know, life and navigate our society and navigate the challenges that life will inevitably throw at us. And so these 6 C's are calm, clarity, connections to resources, competence, courage, and compassion, particularly self-compassion. And which, you know, you can think of those as 6 tools that you can implement to rebalance yourself. But also when you are in balance and you're using those tools, that also creates a really mentally healthy and emotionally healthy state. So I think that's interesting too. It really depends on how we look at it and what someone's standards are. And I think we all have markers for, you know, what mental health means to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's so neat that you surveyed your audience to get some feedback there. And I like the simplicity of the framework, and I think it says a lot, you know, the low tension, high energy, because as you mentioned, you can apply that to various mental health diagnoses and see sort of where that fits in, and that the balance is somewhere towards the middle. And then also, I think it's really interesting the framework that you shared too about the 6 C's with Linda Graham. So I'm interested to hear a little bit about that. So feel free to connect that to any of the questions in throughout our conversation, because I think it's a helpful framework too. So to understand a little bit more, because, you know, everyone comes up against different obstacles when they're dealing with mental health concerns or trying to prioritize their mental health or improve. What are common obstacles that you see that women come up against in trying to better balance their mood?
I mean, so this essentially you're asking about, like, what are some of the roots to somebody not feeling optimally mentally healthy? And it can stem from various things. I always look at, like, essentially, so if you think of a plant that's sort of wilting, isn't in its optimal, healthy, vital state, you need to examine sort of like what are the conditions that plant is in, like what's the soil that it's in. And I think we can look at these like patterns in our society that don't necessarily lend to optimal mental health, right? So things like nutrition, you know, if you're just, you know, if you're not thinking too much about what you're eating and you're just kind of following the standard American diet, there are certain nutrients that are deficient in that diet and overemphasized in the diet that don't necessarily support our brain health and mood. Things like blood sugar and how we're sort of taught to structure our meals and taught to eat, even the way we're taught to view our bodies, and in kind of equating health with a low body weight and food restriction, you know, which can definitely impact our mental health if we're not able to nourish ourselves. The pressures that we have in terms of raising a family and working a full-time job and commuting, and the busyness in life that doesn't lend to us being or connecting or spending time in nature. And I think a big thing I see too is this sense, it's like, you know, essentially like our brain energy becomes depleted at the end of the day. And that can sort of lend to addictive behaviors, and not necessarily in the sense of substance abuse where you're over drinking or consuming a drug, but something like, you know, how we will sort of mindlessly engage with social media or television, or people will talk about, you know, emotional eating at the end of the day. So these sort of patterns that, because we're so exhausted, you know, we don't have the capacity or energy to connect in our lives with the people in our lives, with ourselves, with a cherished hobby that might create balance and meaning in our lives. And so what a lot of my patients will tell me is just this sense of imbalance because they're so overextended. And so we're always looking at, you know, how do we nourish ourselves? How do we build in time where you can connect with yourself? You can wind down at the end of the day to fall asleep. You can set yourself up for a good day by nourishing your body. What do you eat? You know, how do you think about food, right? Because even people who are really into health, it can swing the other way, where you're overemphasizing nutrition, and that's actually creating a negative impact on your mental state because you're overly worried about it and what you're eating and sort of overanalyzing the food you're putting in your body. So we're sort of looking for this place of balance. And, you know, hormonal systems are also important, but I like to work with foundations first with people. So it's sort of like how we, you know, how we connect with ourselves, how we create space in our lives, how we move our bodies, how we spend time in nature, and how we manage and are aware of our minds as well.
I love that. It's, I think, really important to consider all of those things because there's definitely ways that we can go off track and balance. You know, there are certain foundations for human health that we all have in common. So I think it's a really great idea to go to those foundations. And if we want to talk more specifics, what are current practices for promoting mood balance that either you use personally or you recommend?
There's so many things. So I'm running a 5-day challenge to help essentially stabilize our stress response. And there are these key factors, so key pillars, right? One is nutrition, getting enough protein. Like I'll list them, but there's obviously more depth, and we can go into each one, or you know, someone can check out the challenge. You can check out the challenge, but it's you know, how we support our bodies with food in the morning, so enough protein to stabilize those biochemical pathways that can influence our mood, right? So essentially nourishing ourselves and knowing which foods are nourishing. And then also establishing a relationship with our bodies where our bodies will give us feedback as to what foods we best respond to, right? So some people are plant-based, some people are keto, like there's so many different diets because we all have individual needs. And so I think the first step in discovering that process is sort of understanding how food works and how your body feels when you eat a certain way. We talk about, you know, essentially establishing a routine when it comes to food. So having regular meal times, scheduling your day around meal times and having balanced meals. We talk about a bedtime routine and sleep hygiene. So, you know, following nature's circadian rhythms in the activities that are best suited for morning and activities that are best suited for winding down and relaxing in the evening to signal to our bodies what time it is. And what it should be doing, right? In the morning, we should be active, moving, doing things, getting things done. Our brain should be busy and ready to think and do all the things we need to do. And then at nighttime, it's kind of the opposite. We're more in a contemplative being state. Our bodies are still. We're not digesting food. We're feeling relaxed and we're feeling low energy so we can get to sleep. So setting up those patterns by using certain cues. I use mindfulness a lot in my practice as well because I think with mindfulness, it just accelerates this process of self-understanding and connection to our bodies that much more quickly. And there's so many benefits for stepping out of that ruminative, you know, circular thinking mind, that busy mind that stresses us out, and stepping into our bodies and feeling our bodies and just being, I keep saying this, but being present with what is, right? Whether it's a good sensation or a negative sensation, or whether there's no sensation, really just stepping back and inhabiting ourselves rather than the head cloud, right? So being in the body. And so mindfulness is a great tool for that because it also allows us to be able to recognize when, you know, our thoughts or our emotions or even physical sensations have drifted off center. And it allows us to either disengage or potentially bring ourselves back into homeostasis or equilibrium with ourselves. So a very powerful tool to have agency. Yeah.
Agreed. And I think that was so well said, that mindfulness accelerates the process of self-understanding. That is such a beautiful statement and so true. And presence is really everything, and you know, the present moment is all we have, moment to moment. That's what's available to us. So that is the place where balance happens, where change occurs. Everything happens in the present moment. So I really appreciate you sharing some of the practices that you use for mood balance and what you recommend. And considering, you know, at the time of recording that we're going through the COVID-19 crisis, how might we adapt our self-care practices for mental health in this time of social distancing and quarantine? Because I know you've mentioned several times that connection is really important. So how do we do things differently right now?
Yeah, I mean, so a big thing that's been disrupted are when we're talking about the soil that nourishes us, there are key things that were part of our lives that we didn't need to think about or structure into place. Like, for example, I was talking to my friends and, you know, the big relationships, so family, friends, I'm still managing to stay connected to, and even going for 6 feet apart walks with people in my life. But it's the little encounters, the person at the coffee shop, the people that you work with, the smaller, because studies actually show that those little encounters with acquaintances or just people in your life, even though they're not those meaningful, deep connections, actually do contribute to us feeling emotionally healthy and resilient. So it's like we need all of the encounters. But what we can do right now is really make sure that we're nourishing those deep, important connections. And this, I think, you know, there's a mental health program called the Wild 5 Wellness Program, and one of their pillars is social connection. Their recommendations are to either meet in person, and if you can't do that because of social distancing, then call or Zoom 2 people in your life every day. I think it's, you know, it's powerful because sometimes you can go through a day where you're like, oh, I didn't really, you know, have a conversation. Maybe I was just texting with somebody, but we didn't actually sit face to face and talk and share. And so I'm making a huge effort to do that right now, to just keep people in your life and stay connected, right? So, you know, social distancing, it really should be called physical distancing, right? So we can still stay socially connected, even if we're not physically close. I mean, physical connection is also very important, right? So there are these things that are simply, you know, not available to us right now. And so as best we can, trying to maintain what we can with social connection is very important. The other thing is routines. So everyone's routine has shifted in the last few weeks. And so as you know, again, as best we can, really structuring in like when you're eating, when you're waking up, having more or less a plan for the day with reasonable expectations for yourself. I mean, you don't need to necessarily schedule every single second where you're planning all kinds of things, but having, you know, these sort of nourishing routine practices. And also this other one that's actually important and I don't hear talked about too often is having your space in order. Because we're spending so much time at home. And if things feel a little bit chaotic, it just lends to that sense of chaos that we're feeling outside in the environment. And so having stuff neat and tidy and, you know, getting rid of, there's like these COVID closet cleanup groups on Facebook, just sort of like purging things you don't need anymore. It's like spring cleaning time, and just feeling like you're in a beautiful space as best you can could be really important for managing our mental health, and just feeling like, okay, I'm here. My home is not so much a prison as a beautiful place to be, a refuge where I feel safe and calm and creative and inspired. And then the last one, well, 2 last things are nature and movement. And, you know, I mean, obviously like in Toronto, a lot of parks are closed. But I think, you know, as best we can, making time to be in nature is huge. And we know how important that is for our immune system. So, you know, being deprived of nature is not a good thing. And so while it may be risky to get outside, we have to balance that with the benefits and really make a decision around that. And maybe just even 10 minutes walking through a park could make a huge difference in boosting our health and resilience for the day.
Yes, very true. I think those are all really important considerations, and I like the distinction that you made. I agree. I think it should be called physical distancing because the social connections are so important to our mental health and well-being. And I know that you mentioned the word a few times now, so I want to hear your take on it. What does becoming more resilient mean to you?
Well, yeah, I think it's essentially, it's a good way to think of it is bouncing back. So, or actually even better, bouncing forward. So sort of taking these lessons and moving in a direction um, that makes sense. Like, so using experiences and difficulties and challenges to enrich our lives and to strengthen ourselves. And now this is, when someone's dealt with a lot of trauma, it can be difficult to hear this, and there's always, you don't necessarily want to jump right in with what was the lesson from this without having really acknowledged and felt the pain of, and done the healing work around a particular experience. But we're always resilient, and sometimes it's not about, okay, how are you going to bounce back, or how are you going to fix this, or what lesson are you going to take from this? Okay, we're dealing with a global pandemic. Like, how are we going to find, the jewels in the cave? How are we going to find the richness in this experience? And it's not always about that. It's sometimes just about recognizing and thickening a story of how you're already resilient and how you're already responding, and connecting that to your values. And so that can be a big part of it too. I want to read a poem actually about resilience.
Yes,
it's so
good.
Do. It's called For a New Beginning, and it's by John O'Donohue. In out-of-the-way places of the heart, where your thoughts never think to wander, this beginning has been quietly forming, waiting until you are ready to emerge. For a long time it has watched your desire, feeling the emptiness growing inside you, noticing how you willed yourself on, still unable to leave what you had outgrown. It watched you play with the seduction of safety and the gray promises that sameness whispered, heard the waves of turmoil rise and relent, wondered, would you always live like this? Then the delight when your courage kindled, and out you stepped onto new ground, your eyes young again with energy and dream, a path of plenitude opening before you. Though your destination is not yet clear, you can trust the promise of this opening, unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning that is at one with your life's desire. Awaken your spirit to adventure, hold nothing back, learn to find ease and risk. Soon you'll be home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses the world that awaits you. And so it's, I think how that relates to resilience is seeing opportunity and difficulty, for self-growth, for living a richer life, and it's interesting because some of my patients who I've been talking to in the last few weeks as I'm doing online work with them, so seeing them virtually, so a lot of patients whose main concern is anxiety, generalized anxiety, maybe more specific phobias, and I expected before talking to them that they would be having a lot of challenges through this time, that their underlying anxiety issues would be activated by all of the anxiety we're all feeling. But I was actually finding, at least in 50% of cases, that it was the opposite, that almost having a crisis was sort of awakening something inside of them that was almost begging to respond. So sometimes anxiety, it's like you're in a fight or flight state, and if there is no so Freud called he said fear was when there's the presence of danger, and anxiety is, there is no specific thing to be fearful about. It's just this generalized sense of anticipation. So when there is a crisis, someone who deals with anxiety may just feel this strengthening of their internal resolve and this desire to respond. And so a lot of them were like feeling very clear and stable, which is interesting. And so I think, that sometimes moments of crisis can ask us to bring our resilience to the forefront and to bounce forward and see what lessons are here for us, or help us discover our own strength, I think, is the big thing.
So true. And I really appreciate you sharing that beautiful poem. I think it really highlights your perspective too. And thank you for sharing your perspective and your experience. I wanted to hear a little bit about perhaps maybe some resources that you recommend, whether it be websites, some super cool Instagram accounts, podcasts, books, or otherwise that are for mental health and mood balance that you might recommend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think Linda Graham's book is amazing. It's called Bouncing Back. And it's all about resilience. And she has a lot of practical tips in terms of gratitude journaling, hands-on heart, which is a really important practice, breath work. So great book, great resources, tons of really practical strategies and powerful exercises to do. And also a lot of good neuroscience, so accessible scientific background on what resilience is in our brain, which is kind of cool. I love podcasts, and I was thinking of ones to recommend actually. So we have That Naturopathic podcast with Kara and Dave, which is a wonderful resource. It's awesome. They interview really great people. It's not necessarily mental health focused, but they talk to different naturopathic doctors in our community. And, you know, naturopathic doctors always have great, cool things to say about how to manage certain health conditions, or even how to look at health in different ways. I really like the polyvagal podcast. So our vagus nerve is our rest and digest, our parasympathetic nervous system. So there's a theory called polyvagal theory about our nervous system and how it toggles between fight or flight and rest and digest. And, or, you know, cool, calm, collected is also another way we can think about the parasympathetic nervous system. And so they talk about trauma and how we can respond and come back from it, as well as the physiology, so that neuroscience, but what actually happens in your body when you're feeling anxious, and what are some practices you can use to bring your body and your nervous system back into balance. Insights at the Edge is another one that deals with more like mindfulness topics and secular Buddhist philosophy, and a lot of really great interviews and practices and insights at the Edge for, you know, for how to cultivate that sense of presence and mindfulness in your life. So those are some I recommend.
Thank you. Awesome. And Talia, where can you be found online?
So you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Talia ND, DRTALIND. And on Facebook, I have a community called The Good Mood Project. And so there we have 5-day meditations, I share articles, I do interviews with people, and we talk about mental health stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom today. I know that the women in my audience are really going to resonate with what you've shared, and thank you for all the perspective and resources. It's been really wonderful talking with you.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. It was great.